Okay, so is the welfare state worth saving? I will try and tackle this question today through thinking about my book, telling you a bit about that and how that unfolds, which is kind of implicitly speaking to the question, and then towards the end I'll kind of more explicitly offer some thoughts on whether I think the welfare state is worth saving. Okay, was that? Yeah. Okay, so I also have a plug for my book. So yeah, that's The Welfare State Generation. So what is this book? So this book makes a big overarching argument that the welfare state has been so central to the lives of women born in mid-century Britain, so between kind of the late 1930s and the early 1950s, that we should term them the welfare state generation, right? And in my opinion, the post-1945 welfare state, so the Attlee government's expansion of the welfare state in 1945, is one of the most transformative changes in kind of British 20th century history. It's the pivot, in my opinion, on which the century turns. But surprisingly, we actually know very little about how it kind of developed across the 20th and early 21st century from the perspective of historians, and almost nothing about how it influenced people who grew up within it. So not just kind of a top-down political way of thinking about it, but actually kind of a life experience way of thinking about it. And the argument is that it had the kind of these really wide-ranging effects on women's lives, and that it not only had these effects on their lives in childhood, but we can track the significance of the welfare state across the life course, so across the late 20th and early 21st century. I think that's important as well to think of them as a prism, and this is why I really like the idea of generation, because generation gives you the concept of the ways in which individual lives have kind of a dialectical experience with the kind of wider social, political and economic situation, and that lives kind of ebb and flow across the course of time with these bigger social, political and economic changes, and they affect those changes as well, right? So it's not a one-way way of thinking about change. And one of the things I think differently about them from the beginning is that I don't only think of the women as kind of passive receivers of state services. So often that's the way in which women are primarily conceptualised by historians in relation to the welfare state. And it's one reason I chose this picture. So it was really, really, really hard to find a book cover for this picture. I went back and forth with Bloomsbury, because they wanted a kind of classic social realist, black and white, kind of scruffy young mother and son on like a post-war council estate. But that's not how I was thinking about these women. I wanted something that showed the women as workers and in colour, and this is literally, it took months to find this picture. Okay, so oral history. So the book is shaped through oral history. Every single argument in the book emanates outwards from the oral history. It's not illustrative, it's absolutely central. And I feel like if someone's going to give you hours of their time to talk to you about their lives, then you owe them that. You owe it being something more than illustrative. What you also owe them, in my opinion, is that when they tell you about their life history, that you also pay attention to what happens kind of post-midlife. So oral historians are really bad for interviewing people, saying it's a life history interview, and then really only being interested in people's memories up until about like their 20s, maybe their 30s. And I feel like what we're doing now is perpetuating the same problems of making kind of people and women invisible post-midlife, and we're also like have these incredibly rich resources that we're not making use of. So when I say I interviewed them like across the life course, like I really did, I really started with where were you born, and we went right up to present day. I interviewed 36 different women, mixed in terms of class background, most of them from a working class background, but many had social mobility. And I think the thing that's really interesting about this book, and hopefully powerful, is that I had no welfare state as a frame, right, when I interviewed these women. So this started out as part of my PhD, and I had this like incredibly brave supervisor who, when I said to her, look, I don't have a theme for my PhD, what I want to do is go and interview these women born in the mid-century, and I want to write a PhD about what they tell me. Like, I don't want to have this hypothesis that I impose on their lives and I shape questions around it and I get the answers that I think I want. I actually just want to ask them about their life and see what happens. And so the welfare state is something that emerged from the interviews. It's not this framing and hypothesis I had, and this emerged out of asking them about childhood, about education, about employment, about relationships, about retirement, as just this absolutely central framing way of understanding their lives. And one thing as well that I think is also important is that when we do women's history, when we do life history, that we also think about how does this individual life experience also reframe the way we think about bigger narratives. So it's also about something more than just the individual for me. As I said, it's kind of like this dialectical process of change. So I also wanted to engage in really big themes from British history in this period, as well as kind of thinking about the individual self. So I don't know how much you guys have done about kind of definitions of the welfare state, and there isn't necessarily one agreed way of thinking about it. The way that I think about it is very expansive, so it includes all these things kind of about education, for example, and employment, as well as social security. But it also has some kind of more intangible effects, which I'll talk about later. So I was influenced, I think, by feminist scholars of the welfare state who did pioneering work in the 70s to kind of redefine the welfare state and to argue that a welfare state is always something more than just simply a set of services. So this is Elizabeth Wilson's book, Women in the Welfare State, and she's born in the late 30s, so she's fourth in my generation, as did many, many feminist theorists of the welfare state, which I think is really important. And she talks about the welfare state as a kind of an ideology or a set of ideas about society. In this case, a lot of the feminists were critiquing the welfare state because of the way in which it was premised on the male breadwinner model. And that was an underlying issue with the welfare state, and it does mean that a lot of the women's experience of the welfare state was contradictory, right? We don't have to say it was 100% positive to say that it was meaningful and significant and valuable to them. But I think this idea about it being a set of ideas as well as services is something that I want to come back to at the end. And then another thing that influenced me, perhaps less so in the book, but it's something that I've been thinking about more and more, is about what is the relationship between the welfare state and the wider social contract. And we kind of think of the social contract theorists as kind of the golden age of the 17th and 18th century, Locke, Rousseau. But there was also a moment when scholars thought about the social contract in Britain in the wake of the Second World War and after the introduction of the welfare state. And I think for me, the most effective thinker was T.H. Marshall, and he wrote this really famous essay from a lecture he gave in 1950. And he argued, and he thought that we were getting there with the welfare state, that people deserve the right to a modicum of economic welfare and security, but also the right to share to the full in the social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to the standards prevailing in society, right? And I think, again, we're thinking about what's the intangible benefits. And I think when we understand this generation coming back to these ideas about it being, about the welfare state being more than services, but being some kind of meaning of the way that life was shaped and what you kind of were made to feel like as a person in that society is very important. So if we get to kind of my book and these women that I'm thinking about, so these mid-century women, one of the most famous of them is Caroline Steedman. I don't know if you've read Landscape for a Good Woman, which is this incredible biography that she wrote of her and her mother. Amazing. And all historians get taught this quote. I don't know if you've looked at this, but she wrote this. She said, and she's born in the 40s, "I think I would be a very different person now if orange juice..." So when Steedman's talking about it, when she's talking about orange juice and milk and dinners at school, she's talking about the welfare state. So she's talking about the ways in which the state started to kind of intervene directly in children's lives, and they could feel it and they could see it. And this is kind of a classic government orange bottle of orange juice. But I don't know if anyone's read work that talks about the kind of colonial roots of the welfare state and what was required from the colonies in order to produce this amount of orange juice. And it is really, really interesting and fascinating, the colonial roots of the welfare state as well. But the other quote that sometimes is talked about less, which I think is interesting, so this is a working class girl and her autobiography talking about the state, but Angela Carter, the writer, who's a middle class woman, she said, "We've got the full force of the Attlee administration behind us and all they stood for. All that free milk and orange juice and cod liver oil made us big and strong and glossy-eyed and cocky, and we simply took what was due to us whilst reserving the right to ask questions." They're both fascinating, but I think the right to exist versus took what was due is also kind of showing some of the underlying class connotations of the differences in the welfare state. But I also kind of keep coming back to this idea of value because I think it's partly what explains some of these debates about intergenerational tensions later. So I'll come back to that. So the other thing that frequently came up in the interviews and comes up in autobiographies as well is this idea of the spectre of the Second World War, but also very specifically the spectre of the interwar period. So that kind of not only the economic depression, but the brutality of the welfare state in that period, or even what we can even call kind of a nascent welfare state. So frequently you get an unprompted, this is just talking about childhood, women talk about the ways in which their parents frequently told them horror stories about the interwar period. So this one specifically is about healthcare, these kind of scare stories that people died before healthcare was available in the NHS. There's also the famous one about kind of dentures and eyeglasses. As soon as the welfare state opened, there were queues and queues and queues of people who suddenly had they neglected their kind of everyday health needs in the interwar period. And you also get this in relation to other things. We get it about housing. We also get it about school, about girls who got places at grammar schools in the interwar period and couldn't take them up because their parents couldn't pay the small fees over the uniform. So right from being young, it's not only the value that they feel like they're now getting from the welfare state, but this spectre of the interwar period kind of looms over the interviews. So, for kind of time issues, I could talk about the NHS, which I think is very, very important because it's universal, housing, other things, but I'll just briefly talk about the education system because I think that's probably absolutely key in my book and key for thinking about the welfare state. And I think that education sometimes gets neglected in discussions of the welfare state. I think anything that's kind of seen as a positive, like pensions or education or something that we deserve, is siphoned off now in discussions of the welfare state, and it's all kind of social security and people abusing the NHS and all these things. So one of the things that changed, and I think is one of basically the most important piece of legislation of the 20th century, is the 1944 Education Act. And what that did is it introduced what was ostensibly a tripartite system of education. So you would have secondary modern schools, you would have technical schools, and you would have grammar schools. But in reality, most local authorities decided not to have technical schools and literally just to funnel all kids either into secondary moderns or into grammar schools. And in order to decide where you were going to go at 11, you start the 11 plus. This Education Act was amazing for girls because it was the first time free secondary education was available, right? So before, where your parents might have sent their son to the grammar school but they wouldn't have sent their daughter, kind of those considerations are out of the window now. But it's also important to note that girls had to get higher scores on the 11 plus to pass the boys because there were less places. So inherently, you have to be sober. I've tried to, I don't know if anyone's seen 11 plus maths test, I've tried to sit one, I don't think that I could pass it, and I didn't A-level in maths. And this was incredible, and this for a long time was considered the engine of social mobility in post-war Britain, right? It's the grammar school. And historians have started to unpack this and said actually that's not exactly what was happening, in part because 75% of working class kids went to secondary modern. So suspiciously, 75% of middle class kids passed and only 25% of working class kids. We can talk about all the kind of underlying eugenics of an education test, or if an IQ test is simply a middle class culture aptitude test, as is sometimes called in Janet and John knowledge, we call it. And it did produce some mobility, but we think more now about like the structural changes and the welfare state being the structural change. So rather than the grammar school itself producing social mobility, because of this expanding economy and this huge investment in infrastructure, you actually have structural changes which needs workers, right? But there was a feeling as well, if you passed the 11 plus, particularly if you were a working class girl, that you were something, you were bright, and that message was, although the schools were kind of very uncomfortable middle class spaces, it also imbued again this sense of like you are somebody. But this could cause tensions because, of course, if only 25% of working class kids are passing, you get these like huge rifts in sibling or sister relationships. So Sylvia passed the 11 plus and her identical twin failed. And she gave me this quote, and I'm just going to she was talking about, I interviewed her just after her 70th birthday party with her twin. That's where this exchange occurred, at their 70th birthday party. So she said, immediately I felt in a position of advantage over my sister, so when she passed, right? And in a way, I've never discussed this properly with my sister because there are issues that she's quite bitter about, and so it's quite difficult. And she has flung at me recently, how do you imagine I felt when you went to the grammar school? And that was at their 70th birthday party. So it was amazing for some kids, but it is one of the ways, again, in which they were kind of contradictory and sometimes difficult experiences for kids as well. Like, it wasn't this 100% positive experience. So when they left school, and even these working class girls who went to the grammar school, that didn't necessarily translate into getting a lot of qualifications. They often didn't stay on until 18, they often left at kind of school leaving age at 15 or 16. And only 1 in 600 girls, right, working class girls went on to university in the 1960s, 1 in 600. And so, again, we think of it as an age of social mobility, but it was, but in a way that's much more complicated than that. And their career advice in the schools was usually go to teacher training college or you could become a secretary, right? And if you went to a grammar school, you could become a grammar school teacher, and if you went to a secondary modern school, you could become a primary school teacher. That was the message, regardless of any of your own kind of individual sense of self and skill set. But what happened when these girls left school? Often disillusioned, because one thing I think that's important that I get into is thinking about moments of immobility. Where might some of these girls who went to grammar school have expected to have social mobility and they didn't? And what does unexpected immobility produce is an interesting question. But what they did leave school into was this kind of vibrant economy with a safety net of the welfare state. And again, there was no exact difference between the economy and the welfare state throughout this period, because an expansive welfare state is an economic engine in lots of ways for employees, but for just infrastructure investment in that kind of Keynesian way, it's actually important to grow the economy. And it was part of the structural change to the economy at this time that was starting to move from an industrial to a service sector economy. So you had a lot more white-collar jobs in the welfare state. So not even just nurses and teachers, doctors, but kind of more prestigious white-collar role, administrative roles in the private sector. And what we get at this moment, we think about this moment in these girls' lives, their late teens, early 20s, they're just kind of doing what they want to do. It's kind of like, not those constraints, those boundaries, but they're not anxious, they're not planning. They feel like they can try things out and take risks, and they're not anxious about what's going to happen and what qualifications they have. And if they don't like a job, they leave it. A lot of them go to work as things like au pairs abroad, even working class girls. They dabble with art, think about going to art college. And even this kind of young age of marriage, young average age of marriage in the post-war period, should be conceptualised as that it was about actually booming economy and the welfare state, because in the 30s it was actually such a big undertaking to get married, because you had to move out of the family home and you had to save up the amount for the thing, and were you going to be able to pay your rent, and were you going to keep your job? But that didn't really matter in the 50s and 60s. So I'm not saying they suddenly became fully self-actualised beings, but there were just these possibilities, these cracks and dissonances. That is what I think is kind of a really important intangible impact of the welfare state. So it was tangible in the sense they had a safety net and there were jobs, but it also just made them feel like I don't have to be scared and anxious and plan all the time. And Simon Stratzer at Cambridge has done this really incredible work on the early industrial revolution in Britain, and showing that actually having the Elizabethan poor law in place much earlier than other countries across Europe was one of the reasons why the British Industrial Revolution took off earlier, precisely because providing welfare rather than leading to kind of laziness and inertia amongst the general population, it leads to a kind of dynamism and experimentation. And I think that's kind of a smaller version of what these women were experiencing in this period. But then what happens? So at some point they do experience occupational social mobility, but actually it's in the 1970s, this generation of women. And what it's highly influenced by is this secondary expansion of the welfare state that I don't know how much it's talked about in social policy, but it's barely ever talked about in history, which is the Wilson government of 64 to 70, particularly his majority government of 66 to 70, made a decision to massively expand the welfare state again. And they also did a lot of capital projects. They built new schools, they built new hospitals, they needed employees to staff these new institutions. So every time you expand the welfare state, you need trained employers. and you need to provide kind of decent jobs. So another thing that happened during this time in the welfare state is one of the first sectors to introduce decent part-time and flexible roles for women, which was just not available in the private sector. They were terrible terms and conditions. And it just so happened, so also as part of this expansion, he introduced the kind of new layer of higher education, the polytechnics. He founded the Open University, which was his passion project, and he also expanded further education colleges. And what happens is you get this generation of women at this time, a lot of them got married, they might have children, they feel a little bit restless, like, kind of thought my life was going to maybe be something else, or I kind of thought I was going to be satisfied by this, and I'm not. And what happens is that because he's expanded the education system, but he's also, there's no fees, but also he's taken away barriers, right? So you don't necessarily need qualifications to go and study at a polytechnic or a university, because he gave these spaces the power to decide themselves what the students needed to enter. So they would look at portfolios, they would do interviews, and the local authority would get involved, and they would give money for kind of grants and childcare. And it wasn't thought of as kind of this set of hurdles to jump over. So when they wanted to change, when they were feeling restless, there were these possibilities and spaces to do so. And about 40% of the women in my sample did so, and it was nothing to do. I wasn't expecting it. It wasn't something that I recruited for. They just kept saying it over and over and over again. So this is an example of one woman who did so. So Rita, born in 1952, and she said, kind of summed up what I'm kind of trying to get at here, which is it wasn't like this plan. It wasn't like I have a strategy. I want social mobility. She just said, so she was a grammar school girl, but she left without any qualifications. And she said, going back to education was not necessarily about career plans, but instead about wanting something different than the life that seemed mapped out for me. And she did, and she went on to work in one of these new polytechnics, and this was common. So women would be mature students in these spaces, but then there were jobs in these spaces, and they filled them. And they filled them also in social work, in kind of new kind of layers within the NHS, and there were just a lot of possibilities for them to do that, and there was a career ladder there for them. So it wasn't a plan for social mobility, but this is the moment when most women I interviewed, if they experienced social mobility, was actually in the 1970s. And this is a different model of social mobility than this kind of long-range scholarship boy that historians talk about who goes to the grammar school. It's actually a much more functional expansion of the welfare state that happened just at the right moment in their lives. And what also happens, I think, it's these women, suddenly in the 70s you get, I actually think the 1970s is the moment when, if we think about what is the biggest moment when people who worked in the welfare state had the power to shape that in practice, had the most scope to change that on the ground, it's the 1970s. And part of that is the rise of women, and particularly working class women. So what a lot of the women who had social mobility and went to work in the welfare state in the 70s told me is they used these phrases like, my work was emotionally political, or I was doing politics through work. And if I tried to ask them some kind of specific questions about politics in the 70s or feminism, they were like, that's just not the way I thought about it, right? That's like just not the way to think about it. So yeah, emotionally political, doing work for the welfare state. This interview said to me, I wasn't politicised at all really, but I was in my commitment to education. I had young children and I was reading up for work, writing lectures, so I suppose my political commitment was to education. I believe education is a political act because of its transformative power. And she did all sorts of really interesting things. She did all sorts of practical things in the way she taught, also in the way she did like admissions policies. And this thing of like changing admissions policies kept coming up as well. And also this very specific idea that a lot of women kept talking about how we shouldn't separate kind of technical knowledge from like academic knowledge, and like the ways in which, for example, Rita, who had social mobility at Polytechnic, she worked in film, and she said it was always I would make films and someone else would interpret them for me. Like I couldn't interpret it for myself. So like how do we actually think in more complicated ways about the way that knowledge is produced? In social work, they did all sorts of things related to equality, and in schools they introduced kind of women's issues into the classroom, and also these women are some of the women who founded women's history, right? Women who worked for these polytechnics and further education in the 70s, and they also founded in the 80s the kind of any knowledge we have about gender and class, like those incredible feminist bourgeoisian sociologists. So they really transformed the way it operated in practice in the 70s. But then, that's kind of the good times. And then we get Thatcher elected in 79, and this is one of the reasons why it's very important to think about life course, because before this, we often get told this kind of very rosy story of this generation. They got everything, everything was great, they experienced just pure progress, and historians should always be cautious when people kind of throw around progress narratives. And in fact, what I found is, in the story of the life, you'd get this sort of switch. Suddenly there'd be, things would kind of darken, and you could feel it with all of them would happen into, like, especially if they were working the state. And then we get to kind of the late 1980s. And precisely because they were the people who were benefiting from the state, they were workers for the state, they were at the front line of the changes that happened to the state. And it's a myth to think that what Thatcher did was reduce the size of the state. She actually redirected where that money went to managerialism and to disciplinary mechanisms. So anyone who thinks about the miners' strike cannot think that this is a government that is reducing state spending. They're just taking it away from welfare and the front line of welfare. And I define this process as called deprofessionalisation. So this is what these women experience. So it's kind of like a counter-narrative to deindustrialisation, which is a very masculine way of thinking about what happens in the 80s. And these women experience three prongs of deprofessionalisation: devaluation of professional expertise, the rise of managerialism, and a loss of status. So they might be in the same role they were in 10 years ago, but it was massively reduced in terms of status. And it was really hard, and they really kind of spoke about it very emotionally. And this is just one woman who says she was a teacher, and she was talking about working in education and how it changed. And she said, if I had any say in the matter, which of course I don't, because the government never consults teachers, I try to revive the principle of education for education's sake. The government talks about its great achievements in improving education through targets, but it's complete nonsense. All that happens is that teachers have learned to adapt their methods in order to fit the targets and tests. So it becomes about kind of targets, tests, metrics, managerialism as a role that has value of its own accord. So instead of people, managers in the state, being promoted upward, they were brought in from the private sector because, if you're a management consultant, if you're a manager becomes a skill on its own, devoid of any kind of professional knowledge. And a lot of women actually experience downward social mobility at this time, and particularly women who have upward social mobility. So people who have upward social mobility are always more precarious in their new class, and they have downward mobility. And one woman who experienced this is Anita. She was made redundant in the early 1990s, and she's really struggled to work since then. And she said this to me, she was actually crying. She said, I want to be out getting on. I want to make change happen. It's hard to know how to do it, so I'm trying to change myself rather than the outside world. But that's not easy. So what we get here is, I think, a really interesting tension between what I think is a welfare state disposition, which is I want to be getting on, I want to make change happen, and I want to change the outside world, right? It's not all about me. But neoliberalism, which is all deprofessionalisation and this kind of late 80s project that we've all been living with since then, flips it, and it makes it about you. You lack something. There's something in you that needs changing. You need to change yourself. And so it flips the responsibility onto you. If you can't get a job, if you've had down mobility, it's on you. Society doesn't owe you anything. There's no such thing as society, right? Again, I'm going to come back to this to think about it, so welfare state, let's see. So kind of as we get closer to the present day, one thing that, and I know that Gemma's interested in and you guys might have discussed, is this discourse that's emerged that is just everywhere. I just did a search in just The Guardian to think about like how, and this is just one of these. I think was just a couple of months ago. It's everywhere. It permeates popular political discourse. And there's this idea that it benefited disproportionately, and now it's the detriment of future generations, and they're not paying it forward. They're selfish. And again, like baby boomers is a slightly bigger category that I'm talking about, so we tend to think of people born into the late 50s, early 60s, but definitely women interviewed kind of in this, and it just jars so much of the way that I felt when I spoke to them, and like it just doesn't seem to make it's so blunt of a tool, and for me it doesn't work. But again, it's another reason why it's really, really important to think about older age, because people who are older age are now at the centre of this debate. They've been at the centre, it's since the financial crisis has been, rather than bankers and finance and the kind of the capitalism, it's older people that are lying who have an awful time millennials. I just did not find this. I didn't find it in the way that they exercised their their kind of experience across the life course, and particularly kind of the things they've done when they worked in the welfare state. But I just didn't recognise it even in the way they were living their lives at the time I was talking to them. So they did benefit from welfare policies. They also did benefit more during austerity, so there are certain things that were kept by Cameron Osborne that, where it was cut elsewhere. But again, I want to think about this as, okay, maybe they did, but maybe it's because they felt they could make demands of the state in which people who've grown up under neoliberalism don't make those demands. And again, I'll come back to that in the conclusion. But there are also massive class and gender differences. And one thing that I think is quite problematic is that often generations use as a proxy for class. Often what the media should be talking about is class privilege, and it talks about generational privilege. But that's more formally for kind of newspapers to talk about. So they did suffer, and so many women have suffered in their later work life and had a really difficult time, and been made redundant, found something else, or had been restructured, they perhaps been made to take early retirement, and this was really, really traumatic for them. These women had grown up at a time when employment had become much more central to identity, and they'd also just become much more used to kind of being something in the public sphere, having a voice, having value. And I think one thing that my book showed as well is that retirement is really, really difficult for these women, and that's something that's just not acknowledged in the literature. I think maybe it's always been overestimated how much easier it is for women to retire than men, but I think particularly now, it was actually quite a traumatic experience. And even women who looked forward to it and retired when they wanted had still found it very difficult to negotiate, to figure out, who am I now? Who am I in society? I don't just want to kind of go back into the home. And what a lot of them did is they're using their welfare state expertise that they gained in their professional life to fill vital gaps in provision in voluntary roles and to advocate for state provision. So they were continuing to use this knowledge that they developed to try and kind of alleviate some of the worst of austerity Britain. And also some of them were doing that in a way that was quite, privileged. Some middle class women were, they're still like, I advise the government, I sat on this panel, like they're there at the front line of advocating. Or some women, it was just in their local area, it was all sorts of different registers. And they also, of course, were filling in as welfare for their daughters in the home, looking after children so that women could work, so that women could stay in the labour market. And there's really interesting research that shows if grandmas kind of step back from doing the unpaid labour they do for their daughters in the home or sons in the home now, a lot of women would have to leave the labour market. So I think that they repeatedly showed awareness that they'd benefit from the welfare state. They knew it, right? I was on these protests in 2009-10 when Clegg was my local MP in Sheffield, and I said to my friends, vote for Clegg, he's awful, and they did, and they regretted it instantaneously. So they repeatedly kept saying, we understand that we benefited from the welfare state, and that the welfare state is a key mechanism for kind of producing social mobility, right? So this is Claudia, she was from a working class background, she had mobility, and she said, education is one route that is increasingly shut off to people like me, whose families came from different backgrounds. The level of debt that students have to accept, the transition of universities into businesses, the cuts in health and social welfare, the meteoric rise of housing values and the absence of council housing. And this came up again and again, they know. And that's leading to all sorts of interesting tensions in the way they think about the welfare state. In part, some of them are voting Tory because they say, actually, they're the only ones who understand, we witnessed the fragility of the welfare state from the 1980s onwards, and all we need to do now is be on the defensive and just keep it the size it is and protect it and make good, Tories don't make good financial decisions, but, it's often framed that way. And then some of them are really on the front lines of arguing for kind of an expanded welfare state. And also some of them are, they feel conflicted because they've built up value in their house, and they think, actually, my responsibility now as well is to almost be the welfare state for my children. It's actually now my responsibility to take on that role because they don't have a social safety net. And that's producing all sorts of conflicting patterns of voting and things as well. But at the centre of it, they still think the welfare state is central to politics and kind of is absolutely vital and was vital in their own mobility. Okay, so is the welfare state worth saving? So I think to sum up some of the kind of benefits of the welfare state that I think come out of my book is that it provided opportunities for women, and this was both in terms of kind of better quality of life materially, and we really see that in childhood, but also kind of socially, economically. But this was always contradictory and fractured across class and gender lines. And the 1945 welfare state was built on the Beveridge report, and Beveridge was very concerned with maintaining the male breadwinner model. So that was always kind of an awkward undertone of the post-45 welfare state. What it did, which I think is really, really, really important, that's what I'm trying to get across to you, is that it offered this sense of value to individuals and this dynamism, this ability to take risks. So there was this social contract, to go back to T.H. Marshall's language, that said you are entitled to something from state and society. You are not only responsible for it, as it's kind of arisen in the kind of Thatcher Blair era, and also it's not about you changing something about yourself. You are entitled to something. And also an expansive welfare state benefits society as well as individuals, right? Even if we just take social mobility, you need, for a dynamic economy, you need social mobility, you need some mixing, you need some new ideas. You can't, if you think of kind of, occasionally the royal family needs to kind of breed outside the aristocracy, if you think about it like that, like, it can get, we don't want a kind of inbreeding in the economy in terms of ideas and perspectives. So it's actually really, really vital, and just that's just one example of the ways it matters for the society as well as the individual. Also, just because I'm very interested in women, expansive welfare states still would massively benefit women. And again, that's unfortunately because there's all sorts of dynamics that still go on about women's care in the home. But we know that they're still the people who are suffering the most from the cuts to the welfare state. Both because when you cut welfare, someone has to do that labour, and instead of that labour being paid labour with some status in the employment, it becomes unpaid labour in the home. And also, deprofessionalisation has absolutely not ended. It continues at pace. Welfare roles are increasingly, private sector, and the declining status and conditions, redundancies, cuts. Like the 76% of the workers in the welfare state are still women, and so that they continue to be the coal face of the cuts to the welfare state. I don't know if you know the Women's Budget Group, but they do incredible research on the ways in which there's huge ongoing economic equality of women, and they often tie it to a weak welfare state, and they're really great. Like, they put out stuff immediately when there's a budget and do like a gender analysis. They're amazing. So it would help gender equality, right, still. But I kind of want to end thinking about, is the welfare state worth saving? Well, yes, but not in its current form. So I think what's happened is the welfare state has been transformed into something that has some sense of opportunity at its core to disciplinary. There's so many disciplinary mechanisms now within the welfare state. Even one example of this was last week, this kind of sick note Britain. So this shows not only the ways in which there's kind of is disciplinary, but also again like the way that professional expertise is being taken away from workers in the state. So doctors won't, it'll be some kind of privatised person whose skill is assessing. It becomes like, what's the skills that are valued in this type of state? It's not anything that's in the state, welfare state. But we also have to remember that the 1945 expansion of the welfare state came out of one of the biggest crises in British political history, and the economy was at one of its absolutely lowest ebbs. And again, so I'm saying putting money into infrastructure of welfare state can actually buoy the economy, right? But also, big changes to welfare happen in moments of crisis. And social scientists call the moment we're living in polycrisis. So perhaps we need to kind of seize more, or make more arguments to seize on a moment of crisis for a moment of big change. I think we need to rethink the current social contract. The welfare state was always simply a part of a changed social contract. And I think one of the reasons there's so much intergenerational tension is that people who grew up in this era, these women, yeah, they do think they have the right to demand things. They do think that they have value. They do want a voice in the public sphere. Maybe they're a bit ground down by neoliberalism, but they fundamentally have that intangible sense of being worth something. And I think people of my generation have not grown up with that. It's all about changes to the individual. And that's in part the tension, but we should be learning from people who feel like they have the right to demand something from the state. That's actually incredibly valuable in society, and we need to go back to that rather than constantly critiquing it. And so I think we need to rethink kind of the social contract and to make the welfare state more about equality than disciplining people. punishing people, presuming people's intentions have bad faith. So this is kind of where I'm going now, so I want to end the project. What I want to think about is, what would a welfare state look like that was part of a more equal social contract in the 25th century? Because of course, it's been over 70 years now. And I think one thing that I'm thinking about and where I want to go with this is, okay, right, if we want to rethink the social contract, whose knowledge experiences could we use to explore this? One, I think women. If women are still the ones who are the most affected by the welfare state, we need to speak to women. But I also think older women, older people generally, precisely because they know what it feels like to live through an age where you have a voice, you feel valued in some sense, you feel like entitled to make demands, and we need that energy in the new social contract and in the welfare state.